Sunday, March 18, 1945, Camp Florence, Arizona. The dining hall fell into an eerie silence as Sergeant Orville Yates and his kitchen crew carried in the serving platters. 63 German women prisoners sat rigid at their tables, their backs straight despite months of captivity, their faces carefully composed into masks of dignified neutrality. They had learned to expect the unexpected in this strange American desert camp, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to witness. The first platter emerged from the kitchen doors, and several women visibly stiffened. Steam rose from perfectly roasted chicken, the skin golden brown and glistening with butter. The aroma that followed was something most of them hadn't experienced in over 4 years. Real meat, not the gray mystery substance that had occasionally appeared in their rations back home. Not the horse meat or worse that had sustained the Reich's forces in the final desperate months. This was chicken, prepared the way their grandmothers used to make it, the way they remembered from peacetime Sunday dinners that now seemed like memories from another lifetime. 27-year-old Hedwig Neumann, a former nurse from Berlin, was the first to break. Her hand flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her hollow cheeks. She had maintained her composure through her capture in France, through the humiliating transport across the Atlantic in a cargo ship's hold, through her first bewildering weeks in this alien landscape of endless sky and red sand. But the sight of that chicken, accompanied by real mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, fresh green beans, and bread that wasn't stretched with sawdust, shattered something deep inside her carefully constructed defenses. Within moments, others followed. 22-year-old Lieselotte Fischer, once a radio operator who had prided herself on maintaining professional detachment under pressure, found herself weeping openly. Beside her, Christa Vogel's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Even 29-year-old Adelheid Braun, the most senior among them and the one who had insisted they maintain military bearing at all times, sat with tears streaming down her face as she stared at the impossible abundance before them. The American guards and staff stood frozen, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected display of emotion. Corporal Lester Goodwin, a young man from Oklahoma who had been taught to see these women as dangerous enemy combatants, felt his throat tighten as he watched their tears. This wasn't the reaction of soldiers facing their captors' charity. This was something far more profound and far more human. Lieutenant Frances Whitmore, one of the few female officers at the facility, exchanged a glance with Sergeant Yates. They had anticipated gratitude, perhaps, or suspicion, or even refusal. But this raw, overwhelming grief at the sight of a simple Sunday dinner revealed something about the war that no intelligence briefing had ever conveyed. These women hadn't just been fighting for their country, they had been starving for it. As the platters were placed on each table, the weeping intensified. Some women reached out tentatively to touch the plates, as if to confirm that the food was real and not some cruel hallucination born of malnutrition and desperation. 6 weeks earlier, on February 4, 1945, a military transport truck rumbled through the gates of Camp Florence, carrying its unusual cargo of German women prisoners. The landscape that greeted them seemed like another planet compared to the gray, bomb-scarred cities they had left behind in Europe. Red sand stretched endlessly under a sky so blue and vast it felt oppressive in its clarity. The women had been captured during the final chaotic retreat through France and Belgium, serving in various capacities for the Wehrmacht. Most had never fired a weapon, but their skills in communications, nursing, and administration had made them valuable enough to the German war effort that the Allies considered them legitimate prisoners of war. Hedwig Neumann stepped down from the truck first, her nurse's instinct automatically assessing the physical condition of her fellow prisoners. They all bore the marks of wartime Germany: hollow cheeks, prominent collarbones, skin that hung loose on frames that had once carried more weight. She herself had lost nearly 30 pounds since 1941, her nursing uniform now hanging on her like a borrowed coat several sizes too large. The camp itself was smaller than the massive POW facilities housing German men elsewhere in America. Barracks designed for perhaps 80 occupants would hold their group of 63. Barbed wire fences surrounded the compound, but they seemed almost decorative compared to the harsh barriers they had seen in European camps. Lieutenant Frances Whitmore stood waiting to receive them, clipboard in hand, her expression professionally neutral. At 28, she was one of the youngest female officers assigned to POW operations, chosen specifically because the Army believed female prisoners required female supervision. She had studied the files on these women during their Atlantic crossing and found herself unexpectedly moved by their stories. Most were young, barely out of their teens when the war had consumed their lives. The processing took 3 hours. Each woman was photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a prisoner number. Their meager possessions were inspected: a few photographs, letters from home that had somehow survived the journey, worn prayer books, and in Hedwig's case, a small wooden box containing medical instruments she had salvaged from her nursing days. Lieselotte Fischer clutched a battered journal filled with carefully coded notes, a habit from her radio operator training. Christa Vogel carried nothing but the clothes on her back, having lost everything in a bombing raid on POWs. Dresden. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that none of them had ever seen, the women were led to their barracks. The beds, while simple military cots, seemed luxurious compared to what they had endured during transport. Each had a thin mattress, a blanket, and a pillow, small comforts that felt almost decadent. That first night, they lay in silence, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the American desert and wondering what fate awaited them in this strange land of abundance and enemies. The morning light revealed what the evening shadows had hidden. In the harsh Arizona sun, the true condition of the German women became impossible to ignore. Sergeant Orville Yates, making his first rounds of the camp's new arrivals, found himself stopping short at the sight of them gathering for morning roll call. He had served in North Africa and seen soldiers pushed to the edge of endurance, but there was something different about the hollowness in these women's faces. This wasn't the temporary deprivation of combat rations. This was the result of years of systematic hunger. Hedwig Neumann stood at attention with the others, her nurse's training keeping her spine straight, despite the fatigue that had settled into her bones. At 27, she looked a decade older. Her dark hair, once thick and lustrous according to faded photographs she still carried, had thinned noticeably. Her hands, which had once been steady enough to thread the smallest surgical suture, trembled slightly from vitamin deficiencies. She had treated hundreds of wounded soldiers during her service, but had been powerless to address the slow starvation that had gripped Germany's civilian population and eventually its military personnel. Beside her, Lieselotte Fischer presented an even more striking picture of deprivation. At 22, she weighed perhaps 90 pounds, her body having consumed its own muscle mass to survive. Her cheekbones stood out sharply, and her eyes, though still alert with the intelligence that had made her an excellent radio operator, had sunk deep into their sockets. She had grown up in Munich in a family of modest means, and even before the war, abundance had never been part of her experience. The ration cards had started in 1939, and by 1942, even those rations had become theoretical promises rarely fulfilled. Christa Vogel, at 24, bore the additional trauma of having survived the Dresden firebombing. She had been working in an administrative office when the first waves of bombers arrived on February 13th. The physical scars from burns on her left arm were visible, but the psychological weight of what she had witnessed showed in the way she startled at sudden noises. Before the war, she had been engaged to be married, planning a life of orderly domesticity. That fiancé had died at Stalingrad, and the life she had imagined had burned in Dresden's flames. The eldest of the group, 29-year-old Adelheid Braun, carried herself with the bearing of someone who refused to be broken by circumstances. A communications specialist from Hamburg, she had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1941, believing in her duty to the fatherland. That conviction had wavered as the war dragged on, and the reality of Germany's situation became undeniable. Sergeant Orville Yates had been running military kitchens since 1942, feeding thousands of soldiers across 3 continents. At 35, he was older than most of the men under his command, a career Army man who had enlisted during the Depression when civilian jobs were scarce in rural Tennessee. His grandmother had raised him after his parents died in the influenza epidemic of 1918, and she had instilled in him 2 unshakable beliefs: that good food was an expression of love, and that no one, regardless of circumstances, should go hungry if you had the means to feed them. But these were enemy prisoners. The distinction mattered to him, or at least it was supposed to matter. He had seen photographs of American POWs held by the Germans, men reduced to skeletons, treated with systematic cruelty. The reports from liberated camps were beginning to filter through military channels, stories that made his blood run cold. Yet when he looked at these 63 women lined up for morning count, skeletal and exhausted, he didn't see enemy soldiers. He saw his grandmother's face during the lean years, saw his sister's children during the worst of the Depression. He saw hunger, and hunger was something Orville Yates had spent his entire adult life fighting. Lieutenant Frances Whitmore approached him after morning roll call, her expression troubled. She had been at Camp Florence for 3 months, overseeing the facility's preparation for female prisoners. At 28, she was ambitious and capable, having fought hard for her commission, in a military that still viewed women officers with skepticism. She had expected to maintain professional distance from the prisoners, to see them as her duty rather than her responsibility. But the reality of their condition had shaken that resolve. These women needed medical attention, proper nutrition, and time to recover from whatever they had endured before their capture. The camp physician, Captain Robert Hayes, had examined each prisoner upon arrival and submitted a report that made for grim reading. Malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, untreated infections, dental problems from years of inadequate diet. Several showed signs of scurvy. 2 had fractures that had healed improperly. The youngest, an 18-year-old named Marta Klein, showed symptoms of tuberculosis. Hayes had been clear in his assessment. These women needed sustained medical intervention and significantly improved nutrition, or there would be deaths in custody. Corporal Lester Goodwin, at 23, the youngest of the regular guards, found himself unexpectedly affected by the prisoners' arrival. He had grown up on stories of German cruelty, had been trained to see them as the enemy. The first meal served to the German prisoners at Camp Florence was oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with butter and jam, scrambled eggs, and coffee. By American military standards, it was standard breakfast fare, nothing special or elaborate. But for the women sitting in the mess hall on that February morning in 1945, it might as well have been a feast prepared for royalty. Hedwig Neumann stared at her tray with an expression that Sergeant Yates, observing from his position near the serving line, could not quite interpret. Was it suspicion? Fear. He had seen prisoners refuse food before, worried about poison or contamination, but this seemed different. This looked more like disbelief. The oatmeal was thick and creamy, made with real milk rather than water. In Germany, by 1943, milk had become so scarce that even children's rations had been cut to nearly nothing. The oats themselves, plentiful and properly cooked, bore no resemblance to the thin gruel that had passed for breakfast in the final years of the war. Hedwig lifted a spoonful slowly, inhaling the steam that rose from it, trying to reconcile this simple bowl of cereal with the reality of the world she knew. When she finally tasted it, the sweetness of the brown sugar, the richness of the milk, the texture of properly cooked grain brought tears to her eyes that she refused to let fall. Not yet. Not in front of her fellow prisoners who were watching to see how she, as the eldest and most composed, would react. The butter on the toast was what broke through Lieselotte Fischer's careful composure. Real butter, yellow and creamy, not the white ersatz margarine made from coal tar that had been standard in Germany since early in the war. She spread it on the warm bread and watched it melt, creating golden pools that soaked into the toast. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted it to her mouth. The taste triggered a memory so vivid it was almost painful. Sunday mornings at her family's apartment in Munich, her mother setting out breakfast before church, her father reading the newspaper, her younger brother complaining about having to wear his good suit. That world no longer existed. Her father had died at the Eastern Front in 1943. Her mother and brother's fate remained unknown, their last letters having arrived over a year ago. Christa Vogel focused on the eggs, scrambled soft and fluffy, flecked with bits of cheese. She had not seen eggs, real eggs from chickens, in over 2 years. The protein rations in Germany had devolved to whatever could be synthesized or substituted, mysterious pastes and powders that bore only theoretical resemblance to actual food. She ate slowly, methodically, her administrative mind cataloging each sensation, each flavor, storing them away like precious documents to be reviewed later. Around her, the other women ate with similar careful attention, their movements almost ritualistic. Some ate quickly, as if afraid the food might disappear. Others savored each bite, making the meal last as long as possible. The coffee was perhaps the most shocking element. Real coffee, not the roasted grain mixture Germans had learned to accept as coffee. The aroma alone was enough to transport several of the women back to peacetime, to cafes and conversations that seemed to belong to another universe entirely. Sergeant Orville Yates sat alone in his small office adjacent to the camp kitchen on Tuesday evening, March 13th, wrestling with a decision that should have been simple but felt impossibly complicated. On his desk sat his grandmother's recipe card, the one for Sunday dinner, the meal she had insisted on preparing every week regardless of how tight money was during the Depression. People need more than just food in their bellies, she used to tell him while he sat on a stool watching her work. They need to remember they're worth caring for, that someone thinks they matter enough to put in effort. He could hear her voice as clearly as if she were standing in the room with him, her Tennessee mountain accent softening the edges of her words. The question before him was whether enemy prisoners deserved a Sunday dinner. Official regulations required that POWs be fed adequately according to Geneva Convention standards, which Camp Florence was certainly meeting. The daily rations provided sufficient calories and nutrition, checked regularly by Captain Hayes to ensure compliance. But there was a difference between adequate and generous, between feeding people and caring for them. And Orville was trying to determine where that line should be drawn for women who had served the Third Reich. He had seen the reports coming out of Europe, the photographs of liberated concentration camps, the testimonies of survivors describing systematic starvation and cruelty. American POWs held by the Germans had returned home as walking skeletons, broken men who would carry the scars of their captivity for life. The evidence suggested that German forces had shown little mercy to those in their power, had used hunger as a weapon, as deliberately as bullets and bombs. By any measure of justice, these German women deserved nothing more than the minimum required by international law. But when Orville looked at them during morning roll call, when he saw them in the mess hall carefully eating their adequate but unremarkable meals, he did not see the architects of atrocity. He saw young women who looked like they had been starving for years, whose bodies showed the effects of prolonged deprivation that had clearly begun long before their capture. He saw faces that reminded him of his own relatives during the hardest years when dignity became a luxury and each meal was uncertain. His grandmother would have looked at these women and seen people in need, regardless of what flag they had served under. Lieutenant Whitmore had noticed his preoccupation and stopped by his office that evening. "You're thinking about doing something special for Sunday," she said. Not quite a question. Orville looked up, surprised that his internal debate had been so transparent. "My grandmother always made Sunday dinner special," he admitted. Said it gave people something to look forward to, reminded them that life was more than just getting through each day. Frances Whitmore settled into the chair across from his desk, her expression thoughtful. These are enemy prisoners, Orvie. Some people would say special treatment sends the wrong message. He nodded, having circled that same argument in his own mind. But they're also human beings who've been hungry for a long time, he replied quietly. The week leading up to Sunday, March 18th, began like any other at Camp Florence, but Hedwig Neumann noticed something different in the air. As someone trained to observe subtle changes in patients' conditions, she had developed an instinct for detecting shifts in atmosphere, and something was definitely changing in the camp's routine. It started on Monday morning when Sergeant Yates requested additional help in the kitchen. Normally, only 2 or 3 prisoners assisted with meal preparation under close supervision, but this week he asked Lieutenant Whitmore to assign 6 women on rotating shifts. Krista Vogel was among the first selected, her administrative background making her useful for organizing supplies and managing inventory. She noticed immediately that the usual deliveries of canned goods and dried staples had been supplemented by fresh items she hadn't seen since arriving at the camp. On Tuesday, a refrigerated truck arrived carrying what appeared to be fresh poultry. Krista caught a glimpse through the kitchen windows and felt her heart skip. She had not seen a whole chicken, fresh and unprocessed, since before the war began. In Germany, by 1943, even the idea of poultry had become a distant memory, reserved only for the highest Nazi officials. The chickens ordinary Germans encountered, when they encountered them at all, were scrawny things that had been picked over by multiple authorities before reaching civilian markets. These American birds looked impossibly large and healthy, and there were dozens of them. Lieselotte Fischer, assigned to kitchen duty on Wednesday, found herself peeling potatoes alongside Corporal Goodwin, real potatoes. Not the frozen or dehydrated varieties that had become standard even in military facilities back home. She worked in silence at first, the familiar motion of the peeler bringing back memories of helping her mother prepare Sunday dinners in their Munich apartment. Those had been special occasions even before rationing, times when the family gathered around a table that held more than just sustenance. The potatoes she peeled now were large and clean, without the dark spots and rot that had characterized German crops in the final years of the war. By Thursday, word had spread among all the prisoners that something unusual was being planned. The women who had worked kitchen duty reported back to the others in hushed German conversations during their limited free time. Adelheid Braun, ever the pragmatist, warned against getting hopes too high. She had learned during her years of service that disappointment was easier to bear if you never allowed yourself to anticipate anything good. But even she couldn't quite suppress the flutter of curiosity when she saw fresh vegetables being unloaded on Friday morning. Green beans, carrots, celery, items that existed in her memory but had vanished from her reality years ago. Sergeant Yates worked with quiet intensity throughout the week, and those who observed him noticed something almost reverent in how he handled the ingredients. He tasted broths, adjusted seasonings, and consulted a worn recipe card he kept in his shirt pocket. It had belonged to his grandmother, stained with decades of use, and contained her instructions for what she had called a proper Sunday dinner, the kind that reminds folks they're loved. On Saturday evening, as the last preparations were made, he stood in the kitchen and wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. The dining hall on Sunday morning had been transformed in subtle ways. The usual utilitarian arrangement of tables remained, but someone had made an effort to make the space feel less like a prison cafeteria. Simple wildflowers, gathered from the desert surrounding the camp, sat in tin cups at intervals along the tables. The windows had been opened to let in the morning air, still cool before the Arizona heat would settle in. Lieutenant Whitmore had insisted on this attention to detail, believing that dignity mattered even in captivity, perhaps especially in captivity. The German women filed in at 1100 hours, as they did for every meal, their movements mechanical from weeks of routine. But today there was an undercurrent of tension and awareness that something different was about to happen. Hedwig Neumann took her usual seat near the center of the room, flanked by Lieselotte and Christa. Across from them, Adelheid Braun sat with her characteristic straight-backed posture, her face carefully neutral. The room filled with the soft sounds of women settling into their places, the scrape of benches against concrete, the rustle of their worn prison uniforms. Then the kitchen doors swung open, and time seemed to stop. Sergeant Yates emerged first, carrying a large platter. Behind him came Corporal Goodwin and two other kitchen staff, each bearing similar platters. The aroma hit them before their eyes could fully process what they were seeing. It was the smell of roasting meat, of herbs and butter, of food prepared with care and attention. For women, who had subsisted on increasingly meager rations for years, who had grown accustomed to the smell of ersatz coffee and turnip soup. This scent triggered memories so powerful they were almost painful. The platters were placed on each table, and the women stared in collective disbelief. Golden brown roasted chicken, the skin crispy and glistening, mashed potatoes, real potatoes whipped with butter and cream until they were fluffy and white. Green beans, cooked tender, but still bright green, nothing like the gray overcooked vegetables they had known. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, with butter that was actually yellow, not the white margarine that had replaced it in Germany years ago. And gravy, rich and brown, made from real pan drippings, not the thin brown water they had learned to accept as a substitute. Hedwig's hand rose to her mouth involuntarily. Her last real meal had been in December 1941, a small Christmas celebration before the full weight of rationing had descended. Her mother had saved her ration cards for weeks to afford a small goose, and they had eaten it together, her mother, her younger sister, and herself, not knowing it would be the last time they would taste such abundance. That sister had died in a bombing raid in 1943. Her mother's fate remained unknown. The tears began with Hedwig, but they spread through the dining hall like a wave breaking against a shore. Within moments, nearly every woman at the tables was weeping openly, some silently, with tears streaming down their faces, others with their shoulders shaking from sobs they could no longer contain. The American guards and staff stood frozen, utterly unprepared for this response. Sergeant Yates felt his own throat tighten as he watched these women, enemy soldiers according to official designation, reduced to tears by the simple act of being fed properly. He had anticipated gratitude, perhaps suspicion that the food might be poisoned or tampered with, but not this overwhelming display of grief and relief combined into something he had no words to describe. Lieselotte Fischer reached out with trembling fingers to touch the chicken on the platter before her, as if confirming it was real and not some fevered hallucination. She had been 19 when the war started, a young woman whose dreams had centered on finishing her education and perhaps finding work in radio broadcasting, a field that fascinated her. Instead, she had spent the past 6 years watching her country consume itself, watching food disappear from markets, watching her own body waste away despite her youth. The last time she had tasted chicken was at her cousin's wedding in the summer of 1940, a celebration that now seemed to belong to a different lifetime, a different world. Corporal Lester Goodwin moved toward the table where Lieselotte sat, concerned by the intensity of her reaction. He had fought Germans in France, had seen enemy soldiers as targets to be eliminated, but watching this young woman weep over a plate of food was destroying every simple narrative he had built about who the enemy was. "Miss," he said quietly, his Oklahoma drawl soft with concern, "are you all right?" Lieselotte looked up at him, her blue eyes red from crying, and tried to compose herself enough to respond in her halting English. "We haven't seen meat in years," she managed to say, her accent thick with emotion. "Real meat, not since I cannot remember." Her voice broke on the last words, and she pressed her hand to her mouth again, trying to regain the control that had kept her functioning through years of deprivation and uncertainty. At another table, Christa Vogel sat with her head bowed, her hands folded in her lap, unable to look at the food before her. The abundance felt wrong somehow, felt like a betrayal of everyone she had left behind in Germany. Her friends in Dresden, those who had survived the firebombing, were certainly not eating roasted chicken and fresh bread. They were probably picking through ruins, eating whatever could be salvaged, if they were eating at all. How could she accept this kindness from her captors when her own people were starving? That evening, after the extraordinary Sunday dinner, Hedwig Neumann sat on her narrow cot with a piece of paper and a stubby pencil, trying to find words to describe what she had experienced. The camp allowed prisoners to write letters home, though everyone understood that most would never reach their destinations. Germany's postal system had collapsed along with everything else, and the chaos of occupation made delivery unlikely at best. Still, the act of writing provided comfort, a way to process experiences that felt too large to contain inside one's own mind. She began carefully, her nurse's training giving her handwriting a precise, legible quality even in the dim barracks light. "Dearest Mama," she wrote in German, "today I experienced something I never thought I would see again. The Americans prepared for us a Sunday dinner like the ones you used to make before the war. There was chicken, real chicken, roasted until the skin was golden. There were potatoes with butter and cream, vegetables that were actually green, bread that was soft and fresh. I wept, Mama. I could not help myself. It has been so long since I tasted real food that I had almost forgotten such things existed in the world." She paused, her pencil hovering over the paper. How could she explain to her mother, if this letter ever reached her, what it meant to be shown such kindness by the enemy? How could she describe the confusion of being treated better as a prisoner in America than she had been as a citizen serving her own country? "The American soldiers here are not what we were told," she continued. "They are not cruel or barbaric. They treat us with a dignity I did not expect. I do not understand this war anymore, Mama. I thought I knew why we were fighting, what we were defending. But if the enemy can show such humanity while our own country—" She stopped, unable to finish that thought on paper, unable to confront fully what the growing revelations about concentration camps suggested about the regime she had served. Across the barracks, Lieselotte Fischer was writing her own letter, this one addressed to her younger brother in Munich, though she had no idea if he was still alive or if their family's apartment still stood. "Dear Klaus," she wrote, "I wish you could have tasted what I ate today. I know you probably cannot even imagine it anymore. Real meat and fresh bread and vegetables that haven't been preserved or substituted. The Americans have so much, Klaus, so much food, so much of everything. We were told they were weak, that they were suffering as we suffered, but it was all lies. They have abundance we cannot comprehend. I don't know what this means for Germany, for our future. If they have this much to give to their prisoners, what must their soldiers have? How did we ever think we could win this war?" Christa Vogel's letter to her aunt in Frankfurt was more practical, listing the items she had seen and eaten, as if creating an inventory for her administrative records. But even her methodical accounting could not hide the emotion beneath. "Aunt Margaret, I counted 6 different items on my plate at dinner today. 6 separate foods, each one real and properly prepared." The days following the first Sunday dinner brought a shift in consciousness among the German prisoners that proved more unsettling than their initial capture. Adelheid Braun found herself unable to stop thinking about the implications of what she had witnessed. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1941, believing in the Führer's speeches about Germany's strength, about the Reich's destiny, about the weakness of their enemies. The propaganda had been relentless and persuasive. America was a decadent nation of mongrels, divided and weak, suffering from economic collapse and internal strife. Britain was exhausted and starving. The Soviet Union was populated by subhuman barbarians incapable of matching German industrial might. But the evidence of her own eyes contradicted every word she had been taught to believe. The Americans had fed 63 enemy prisoners, a feast that would have been impossible to provide in Germany, even for high-ranking officials. They did this casually, as if it were nothing remarkable, as if abundance was simply their natural state of being. Adelheid had worked in communications, had seen the reports coming from the front, had watched as the messages grew more desperate and the requests for supplies more urgent. She had attributed the shortages to the demands of total war, to temporary disruptions that would resolve once victory was achieved. Now she understood that Germany had been fighting from a position of fundamental weakness, that the promises of prosperity after victory had been fantasies built on foundations of sand. Lieselotte brought up these troubling thoughts during the evening hour when the women were allowed to gather in the common area of their barracks. "How long have they been lying to us?" she asked quietly in German, her voice barely above a whisper. "About everything?" The question hung in the air, and several women shifted uncomfortably. To acknowledge the depth of deception meant confronting their own complicity, their own willingness to believe what they were told without question. Krista, who had lost everything in Dresden, spoke with unusual bitterness. "They told us the bombings were terror attacks, crimes against civilians by barbaric enemies. But we bombed London, we bombed other cities first. They told us we were defending ourselves, but we invaded Poland, invaded France, invaded Russia. When did defense become attacking everyone around us?" Hedwig, older and more measured in her responses, tried to find nuance in the situation. "We cannot know what we were not told," she said carefully. "Information was controlled. We saw only what they wanted us to see." But even as she spoke the words, she felt their inadequacy. She had been educated, trained in medicine, capable of critical thinking. At what point did ignorance become willful blindness? She remembered the whispers that had circulated in Berlin, the rumors about what was happening to Jewish neighbors who disappeared, the stories that everyone claimed not to believe but that no one investigated too closely. The weight of comparison extended beyond food to every aspect of camp life. The barracks, while simple, were clean and well-maintained. The medical care provided by Captain Hayes was thorough and professional. The guards, while maintaining appropriate distance, were not cruel or abusive. Several of the women had experience with how Germany treated prisoners, having worked in facilities that processed captured Allied soldiers. The contrast was stark and damning. "We were told we were the superior civilization," Adelheid said quietly, voicing what others were thinking, "that our culture, our values, our race made us better than others." The second Sunday dinner on March 25th was different from the first in subtle but significant ways. The tears had given way to something more complex, a tentative acceptance mixed with lingering guilt and growing curiosity. This time, when the platters emerged from the kitchen, the women's reactions were more controlled, though the wonder remained visible in their faces. But Sergeant Yates had prepared something additional this week, a gesture that would prove more transformative than even the initial feast. He had asked Krista Vogel during her kitchen duty rotation if the German women knew any traditional recipes they might want to share. The question had caught Krista completely off guard. In her experience, conquerors dictated terms. They did not ask the conquered for their cultural contributions. But Orvie's interest appeared genuine, and that evening she had consulted with the other women about traditional dishes they remembered from home. The conversation had been bittersweet, triggering memories of peacetime, of family gatherings, of a Germany that existed before the war had consumed everything. Hedwig mentioned her mother's sauerbraten, marinated beef that took days to prepare properly. Lieselotte described the spätzle her grandmother made, small dumplings that were both simple and sublime when done correctly. Adelheid talked about Kartoffelpuffer, potato pancakes that had been Sunday breakfast staples in her childhood. Orvie listened to their descriptions with genuine interest, making notes on the back of an old requisition form. He knew he could not obtain marinated beef or replicate dishes that required days of preparation, but the spätzle seemed achievable. He studied Lieselotta's explanation carefully, asking questions about consistency and technique, treating her expertise with the same respect he would show any professional cook. The following week, he experimented with the recipe during regular meal preparation, and Lieselotta found herself actually laughing, a sound she had not made in months, when his first attempt produced what looked more like lumpy paste than proper dumplings. "No, no," she said in her improving English, gesturing to show him the proper motion. "You must push through the holes with speed, like this." She demonstrated with a spoon and a colander, her hands remembering movements her grandmother had taught her 15 years earlier. Orvie tried again, and this time the results were better. Small, irregular dumplings that, when cooked and buttered, tasted like home to the German women who tried them during the next Sunday dinner. The psychological impact of this gesture far exceeded the simple addition to the menu. By asking for their recipes, by attempting to prepare their traditional foods, Orvie was acknowledging that they possessed culture worth preserving, knowledge worth respecting. He was treating them not as defeated enemies, but as people with valuable traditions. Other exchanges followed. Hedwig taught the camp medical staff about certain herbal remedies she had learned during her nursing training, treatments that American medicine had overlooked or dismissed. Adelheid helped reorganize the camp's communication system, applying her technical expertise to improve efficiency. The barriers between prisoners and staff continued to erode, not dramatically but gradually, through countless small interactions built around shared purpose and mutual respect. Food remained the central catalyst. April brought unseasonably warm weather to Arizona and news from Europe that shattered what remained of the German women's understanding of their homeland. The war was ending, everyone could see that now, but the reports filtering back from advancing Allied forces described a Germany that bore no resemblance to the country the prisoners remembered or imagined. Lieutenant Whitmore made newspapers available to those who could read English, believing that the women deserved to know what was happening to their country. Hedwig sat in the small camp library, her English now proficient enough to read the reports, and felt the floor drop out from beneath her understanding of reality. Berlin was surrounded, the articles reported. The city where she had trained as a nurse, where she had walked the boulevards and admired the architecture, was being reduced to rubble street by street. The photographs showed destruction on a scale she could barely comprehend. Entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. The zoo where she had spent Sunday afternoons before the war was gone. The hospital where she had completed her training was a crater. But the physical destruction, as devastating as it appeared, was not what broke something fundamental inside her that afternoon. The reports about Hamburg hit Adelheid with particular force. She read the articles quietly, her face growing paler with each paragraph. The firebombing of her home city in 1943, an event she had known about in abstract terms, was described in detail that made her physically ill. 40,000 dead in a single night. Her parents had been in Hamburg then. She had received one letter afterward, her mother's handwriting shaky but alive, saying they had survived by sheltering in a basement. But that had been nearly 2 years ago, and there had been nothing since. The newspaper described a city that had been bombed repeatedly since that first catastrophic raid, a city where survival had become a daily struggle against starvation and cold. The accounts of conditions inside Germany painted a picture of total collapse. The infrastructure had disintegrated. Food distribution had ceased in many areas. Millions of refugees from the eastern territories were flooding westward, fleeing the advancing Soviet forces. Disease was rampant. Children were starving in the streets of cities that had once been proud symbols of German culture and achievement. Lieselotta read these reports and thought of her brother Klaus, trying to imagine what his life must be like now if he was still alive. He would be 18, old enough to have been conscripted into the final desperate defense of the Reich. The thought of him, barely more than a boy, Facing Soviet tanks with outdated weapons and no training made her feel sick. But it was Krista who received the most devastating personal news. A letter arrived through Red Cross channels, forwarded from multiple locations before finally reaching Camp Florence. Her aunt in Frankfurt had survived the bombing raids and managed to get word out. The letter was brief and factual in the way that profound grief often manifests. Krista's mother had died in the winter of 1944 from pneumonia, weakened by malnutrition and unable to fight the infection without proper medicine. On a Wednesday afternoon in late April, Sergeant Yates did something that seemed trivial in the moment, but would be remembered by the German prisoners for the rest of their lives. He had received his monthly care package from his sister back in Tennessee, and among the items she had sent were 6 Hershey chocolate bars. In peacetime, this would have been an unremarkable gift, the kind of thing you might share with friends without much thought. But these women had not tasted chocolate in over 5 years, and for some of the younger ones, the deprivation had lasted even longer. Orvie stood in the kitchen after lunch service, looking at those chocolate bars and thinking about his grandmother's philosophy that small kindnesses mattered more than grand gestures. He found Hedwig first, as she had become the unofficial leader among the prisoners and the one most trusted by both the German women and the American staff. "Miss Neumann," he said, using the formal address that maintained appropriate distance despite their growing rapport. "I have something I'd like to share with you and some of the others, if you'd accept it." He unwrapped one of the chocolate bars, broke it into squares, and offered her a piece. Hedwig stared at the chocolate as if he had offered her a bar of gold. Her hands trembled as she accepted it, and for a long moment she simply held it, feeling the slight softness that the Arizona heat had created, inhaling the rich cocoa scent that triggered memories so powerful they almost overwhelmed her. The last chocolate she had tasted was a small piece her mother had saved from before the war, given to her on her birthday in 1941 as a special treat, when such treats were already becoming rare. She had made it last as long as possible, letting it melt slowly on her tongue, knowing even then that she might never taste chocolate again. Now, 4 years later, in an American prison camp, thousands of miles from home, she was being offered chocolate by an enemy soldier who had shown her more kindness than her own government had in years. She placed the square in her mouth and closed her eyes as the flavor spread across her tongue, and she wept quietly, not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming complexity of emotions she could no longer name or separate. Orvie shared the remaining chocolate with 5 other women, Lieselotte, Krista, Adelheid, and 2 younger prisoners named Marta and Gisela. Each reacted with similar intensity, the simple candy becoming a catalyst for memories of peacetime, of childhood, of a world where such small pleasures had been taken for granted. Lieselotte told him, in her careful English, about how her mother used to make hot chocolate on Christmas morning using real cocoa powder and sugar and milk, creating a drink that seemed like pure magic to a child. May 8, 1945 arrived with news that the war in Europe had officially ended. Victory in Europe Day brought celebrations across America, church bells ringing and people dancing in the streets. At Camp Florence, the atmosphere was far more complicated and subdued. For the German women prisoners, the end of the war meant confronting truths they had been able to postpone while fighting continued. They were no longer soldiers serving their country. They were citizens of a defeated nation that had committed atrocities so profound that the full accounting would take generations. Lieutenant Whitmore gathered the prisoners in the common hall to make the official announcement, though most had already guessed from the activity around the camp and the expressions on the guards' faces. The weeks following victory brought a flood of information that had been suppressed or unknown during the conflict. Newspapers arrived daily with photographs and testimonies from liberated concentration camps. The images were grainy but clear enough to convey the horror. Emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood, survivors who looked more like skeletons than living people, gas chambers, and crematoria that revealed systematic murder on an industrial scale. Captain Hayes made these newspapers available in the camp library, believing that the German women needed to see what had been done in their country's name, but he also made himself available to talk with anyone who was struggling to process the revelations. Hedwig spent 3 days reading every article she could find, studying the photographs until the images were burned into her memory. She had been a nurse, trained to save lives, working for a regime that had been systematically exterminating millions. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. She had never been to a concentration camp, had never been directly involved in the atrocities, but she had served the same government, worn the same uniform, believed in the same cause. At what point did ignorance become complicity? She had heard rumors during the war, whispers, about what was happening to Jewish families who disappeared from Berlin neighborhoods, but she had not investigated, had not demanded to know the truth. Like so many others, she had told herself that the rumors were exaggerated, that surely such things could not be happening. Adelheide's response was different, but equally anguished. She had been a true believer in the National Socialist cause, had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps with genuine conviction that she was serving a righteous purpose. The revelation that everything she had believed was built on a foundation of genocide and evil destroyed her sense of identity completely. Who was she if every principle she had organized her life around was a lie? She stopped eating for 2 days until Hedwig, using her nurse's authority, insisted she accept food and medical supervision. June brought official word that repatriation procedures would begin for German prisoners of war held in the United States. The announcement arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to Lieutenant Whitmore through official channels from the War Department. She read the orders twice before calling Sergeant Yates into her office to discuss the implications. The women who had arrived in February as enemy combatants, who had been transformed through months of unexpected kindness and devastating revelations, now faced a choice that would define the rest of their lives. They could return to Germany, to whatever remained of their homeland, or they could request to stay in America and face an uncertain future as former enemies in a foreign land. Lieutenant Whitmore gathered the 63 women in the common hall that evening to explain the situation. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, outlining the official procedures for repatriation. Transportation would be arranged within 6 to 8 weeks. They would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to their homes, assuming those homes still existed. The War Department would provide basic assistance in locating family members through Red Cross channels. Beyond that, they would be on their own in a country that had been devastated by war and was now occupied by foreign powers. The silence that followed her announcement was profound. Hedwig sat with her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing through calculations of what return would mean. Berlin was in Soviet hands now, according to the newspapers. The city had been divided among the occupying powers, and the Soviet sector included the neighborhoods where she had lived and worked. Reports from refugees described Soviet occupation as brutal, marked by violence and deprivation that in some ways exceeded what the war itself had brought. Even if her mother had survived, even if their apartment still stood, what kind of life awaited her there? She would return as a former auxiliary soldier, someone who had served the regime and then been captured by the enemy. The suspicion and shame would follow her everywhere. Lieselotte thought of Munich, occupied by the Americans according to reports, but still a city of ruins and starvation. Her brother Klaus's fate remained unknown, despite months of Red Cross inquiries. Her mother had not responded to letters, which likely meant she was dead, displaced, or unreachable. What would Lieselotte return to? An empty apartment in a destroyed city, assuming the apartment still existed. The prospect of rebuilding in that environment, surrounded by the rubble of everything she had known, felt overwhelming. But the alternative, staying in America, meant abandoning any remaining family, meant admitting that Germany was no longer home, meant accepting that She had been so changed by captivity that she could not return to her own country. Krista's decision was clearest among them. She had lost her mother, her fiancé, and her city. Dresden existed now only as a memory and a massive burn scar across the German landscape. What remained for her there? The aunt in Frankfurt, who had written about her mother's death, had also mentioned that she was planning to move to her sister's farm in Bavaria, fleeing the city's devastation. Krista had no home to return to, no immediate family waiting. July 15, 1945 arrived with bittersweet anticipation. Sergeant Yates had planned one last Sunday dinner for the German women, a farewell feast for those who had chosen repatriation, and a celebration for those who had decided to remain in America and pursue immigration status. Of the original 63 women who had arrived in February, 41 had chosen to return to Germany despite the uncertainty awaiting them. 22, including Hedwig, Lieselotte, Krista, and Adelheid, had requested permission to stay and were being processed as displaced persons seeking residency. The decision to split the group had been agonizing for everyone involved, creating divisions among women who had become close during their months of shared captivity and transformation. The dining hall had been decorated with more care than usual. Corporal Goodwin and several other guards had gathered wildflowers from the desert, arranging them in every available container. Someone had found fabric to create simple tablecloths, transforming the utilitarian tables into something approaching festive. The American staff had contributed to the meal from their own rations, wanting to make this final gathering as memorable as possible. Lieutenant Whitmore had even managed to procure wine, a rare luxury, believing that the occasion warranted breaking standard regulations about alcohol in the camp. Sergeant Yates had worked for 3 days preparing the meal, determined to create something that honored both the German traditions the women had shared with him and the American abundance that had so transformed their understanding of the world. The menu included roasted chicken, as it had for that first transformative Sunday dinner in March, but also German potato salad made according to Hedwig's mother's recipe, spätzle prepared with Lieselotte's careful instruction, and a sauerbraten that Orvie had been marinating for 4 days using Hedwig's detailed guidance. For dessert, he had attempted apple strudel, a task that had tested his pastry skills to their limits. As the women filed into the dining hall at noon, they found their American guards and staff already seated at the tables, waiting for them. This departure from standard procedure, where staff and prisoners maintained separate spaces, had been Lieutenant Whitmore's idea. "They're not prisoners anymore," she had told Orvie when planning the event. "Some are leaving as friends, and some are staying as potential neighbors. Either way, we should share this meal together as equals." The gesture moved several of the German women to tears before the food had even been served, this final acknowledgement that they were seen as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. The meal began with Hedwig standing to offer a toast, speaking in careful English that she had practiced for days. "To Sergeant Yates and Lieutenant Whitmore and all the Americans who showed us that kindness is stronger than hatred," she said, raising her glass of wine. "You gave us food when we were hungry, but you also gave us something more important. You gave us hope that human beings can be better than their worst moments." 1970, Phoenix, Arizona. Hedwig Neumann Caldwell stood in the kitchen of her restaurant, the Sunday table, preparing the week's signature dinner. At 52, she moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent 25 years perfecting her craft. The restaurant had become a Phoenix institution, known for its unique fusion of German and American cooking, for the warmth of its atmosphere, and for its owner's insistence on maintaining a tradition of Sunday dinners that reminded people, as she often said, that they were worth caring for. The phrase came from Sergeant Orville Yates, who had passed away 8 years earlier from a heart attack, but whose philosophy continued to guide everything Hedwig did. The walls of her restaurant were covered with photographs that told the story she never tired of sharing. There was the original group of 63 German women standing in front of Camp Florence in February 1945, their faces gaunt and uncertain. There was Sergeant Yates in his kitchen, sleeves rolled up, smiling at the camera with the quiet pride of someone who knew his work mattered. There was Lieutenant Frances Whitmore, who had left the military after the war and become a social worker, dedicating her life to helping refugees and displaced persons build new lives in America. And there were photographs from the years since, weddings, citizenship ceremonies, children and grandchildren, a visual testament to lives rebuilt from the ruins of war. Lisa-Lotta, now going by Lisa Fisher. Marshall had married Corporal Lester Goodwin in 1947. They lived in Oklahoma City, where she worked as a translator for the State Department, and he had built a successful construction business. They visited Phoenix twice a year, and their 3 children called Hedwig Aunt Hetty, having grown up hearing stories about the Sunday dinner that changed their mother's life. Krista had earned a degree in library science and worked at Arizona State University, never marrying but creating a life of quiet purpose and dignity. She lived 2 blocks from Hedwig's restaurant and ate there every Sunday without fail. Adelheid had chosen to return to Germany in 1945, unable to reconcile staying in America while her country suffered. She had written faithfully for 25 years, her letters describing the long, painful process of rebuilding Hamburg, of confronting what had been done in Germany's name, of working to create a democracy from the ashes of fascism. She had become a teacher, educating young Germans about the dangers of nationalism and the importance of critical thinking. Her letters always mentioned the Sunday dinners at Camp Florence, how they had taught her that redemption was possible even for those who had served evil causes. The other women who had stayed had built similar lives of contribution and purpose. They had become teachers, nurses, business owners, mothers who raised children to understand that nationality mattered less than character, that former enemies could become family, that transformation was always possible if societies were willing to offer it. Those who had returned to Germany had carried back stories of American kindness that helped bridge the divide between former enemies.